Hello class, and welcome to this presentation on Israel, Christians, and other religions. First, let's talk the rationale for this presentation. We might think of it in terms of the relationship between religion, health, and truth. If many different religions benefit the health of their practitioners, how might Christians think about this fact? On a similar note, if practitioners of other religions have discovered truths or insights about health and perhaps about other things, how might Christians think about and appropriate such knowledge? And lastly, in terms of big picture, how should Christians posture themselves generally in a world where many people pursue truth through many means? Let's take it to the Koenig text to give concrete examples of what I'm talking about. On page 114, I believe this is chapter 8, Koenig reports on, for example, a study done in the modern country of Israel, where secular Jewish subjects still had a significantly higher risk of myocardial infarction, that is, heart attack, compared to Orthodox Jewish subjects. That is, on a study that was done in the modern nation of Israel, those who were active religious practitioners of Judaism showed they were correlated to some better health results as pertains to heart attack than were those who were secularly Jewish. Koenig, on the next page, reports or summarizes a study that was done in India among Hindus. Koenig says multivariate analysis showed that prayer among Hindus in India was a significant independent protective factor against coronary artery disease. So once again, those Hindus in India who were actively engaged in prayer, these individuals were correlated to better health in relation to coronary artery disease than Hindus in India who were not as active in practicing prayer. On the same page, on another study done in India, Koenig reports the prevalence rate of coronary artery disease per 1,000 adults in India was the highest in Sikhs, lowest in Muslims, and identical in Hindus and Christians. In other words, in this particular population, the Muslims in India were the ones who turned out better in terms of coronary artery disease in relation to religious belief and practice. Well, as we use the Koenig text to frame the larger issue and to pose the questions that are before us during this presentation, we return to the biblical text. You should already have read some material from both the Old and New Testaments. We're going to deal with the Old Testament material first here, thinking about Israel and other religions as we read the Old Testament. In your text from Deuteronomy chapter 12, you had Moses speaking for God to Israel and telling Israel what they needed to do when the time came for them to cross the Jordan River and enter the land of Canaan proper and to engage in conquering that land and inhabiting it. And so God, through Moses, tells Israel, you must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess served their gods, on the mountain heights, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, and hew down the idols of their gods, and thus blot out their name from their places. You shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways. At this stage in the text, the prohibition is clear. The instruction for what Israel is supposed to do is clear. The rationale might not be just yet. You find that later on in the text, in verses 30 to 31. Again, the prohibition and the instructions for what they are supposed to do and not supposed to do, but there is something of a rationale here. Take care that you are not ensnared into imitating them. after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire concerning their gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods? I also want to do the same. You must not do the same for the Lord your God, because every abhorrent thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. They would even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. A practice that is documented from the ancient world and depicted here in an artistic picture. What is being depicted here is one of the gods from the ancient Near East, Canaan, and nearby regions. This is a depiction of the god Molech, and you have a worshiper, probably a priest type, offering a baby in sacrifice to the god Molech, while there are other accompanying ritualistic activities going on around the actual offering itself. So what we find is a policy in ancient Israel that Israel is prohibited from practicing or even mixing elements from other religions with their own habits of life as a people. Now, the prohibitions you just read were from the time period of Moses. We can, for our purposes, say roughly 1300s BC. We see other excerpts throughout the Old Testament illustrating the ways in which this crept up in later episodes of Israel's history. So in the 900s BC, when King Solomon was king over all the tribes of Israel, we find in the book of 1 Kings this excerpt. Then King Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab. Let me pause here and say that Moab was a nation state that bordered the people of Israel and was on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and that Chemosh was one of the deities of the people of Moab. So just trying to help keep the names straight here. Solomon built a high place for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. The Ammonites were another people that bordered Israel on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Molech, I just talked to you a little bit about Molech and showed you a depiction of Molech and child sacrifice on the mountain east of Jerusalem. So Solomon, king of Israel, takes these deities and builds shrines for them within Israel. Shrines for these deities may have existed as Israel moved in to conquer Canaan hundreds of years earlier, but now Solomon is building shrines for them once again. He's doing this, by the way, because of his wives. Solomon has married women from all kinds of different lands, different nation states, and so he is incorporating their religious beliefs and practices into his activities as the king of Israel. One of the results from this is God's judgment, where there will be internal division within Israel's kingdom as a form of punishment for what has happened here. Solomon will not pass on a united kingdom to his son. Several hundred years later, in the 600s BC, this divided kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, the sister kingdom from the divided kingdom has already been destroyed by this point. But Judah, the people and the kingdom, has a king named Manasseh, and Manasseh is regarded as one of the most evil kings that the divided kingdom of Judah ever had. And it is King Manasseh that often in the Old Testament is regarded with basically getting in the driver's seat and angling the car toward a cliff and pushing the accelerator. That once King Manasseh has come on the scene, and even after he's gone from the scene, where he leads the people is so terribly far that there is going to be no recovery. King Manasseh built altars for all the host of heaven, the stars, for instance, in the two courts of the house of the Lord, the temple in Jerusalem. He made his son pass through fire. And we think about that depiction of the god Molech and child sacrifice to Molech. There were other deities that may well have received child sacrifice and may have been the ones being worshipped by Manasseh as he sacrificed his own son. Much like hundreds of years earlier, there's going to be God's judgment on Judah because of this. Judah's destruction and exile will be the form of that judgment. What is the rationale for the people of Israel being prohibited from practicing other religions and being judged when they did? Well, at least in the case of the other religions that were characteristic of Israel's neighbors at this time in history, that these religious practices, as indicated in the biblical text, were destructive for the practitioners. And that's why it was important to read the entirety of chapter 12. These religious practices involved things like child sacrifice. So there was this destructiveness for those who practiced these religious practices and held these religious beliefs. The gods you believed in, which gods you believed in mattered in the ancient world. It was significant for the shape your life would take. And it was also destructive for God's mission for humanity through Israel. God was trying to achieve some things for all of humanity by electing one people, Israel, Abraham and his descendants, to reach and be for the benefit and the blessing of all humanity. And this would be thwarted, completely thwarted, if the people of Israel took on the religious beliefs and practices of these other people. Now let's jump a few hundred years ahead and look at that material in the New Testament that you studied, in particular the Christian missionary journeys in the book of Acts, and then something Paul wrote in the book of Romans. In Acts 14, Paul is on what we typically call his first missionary journey after his major conversion in Acts chapter 9. He's in a very Greek city called Lystra, and the story, as you saw, it was the story of a crippled man whom Paul and Barnabas healed. And as a result, the crowd here drew on their understanding and their beliefs of the world, and they engaged in a religious response. They interpreted Paul and Barnabas as representatives of, or even appearances and manifestations of the Greek gods. And so they prepared religious sacrifice offering as a result, because they believed they were being visited by their gods. What Paul does then is he rejects this response on the part of the people and then delivers a message about that response, which is representative of how the people view the gods and engage in religious practice as a whole. He says, among other things, that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God. And there's a variety of ways you might hear this language. It's important to note that Paul is not calling the people worthless. And the worthless things he is referring to has to do more with their religious practices. The fact that they would look at Paul and Barnabas, even though they engaged in a healing act, and see them as gods. That they would make an offering to them. That Paul says, this is worthless. We are just human beings, and we are just servants. And we are servants of a different God. And we want to tell you a little bit about who that God is, and we believe that that God has been active in revealing something of himself to you already, in nature, he will say in a few verses later. So this is one response we see in the narrative of the missionary journeys of the early church, where Christian beliefs and practices come up against other beliefs and practices. So for example, a few chapters later, in what we typically refer to as Paul's second missionary journey, Paul is in the great city of Athens. And he sees all kinds of religious idols all over the city, all kinds of shrines. And he's distressed at just the sheer weight, the volume of all this religious practice and these shrines. And so Paul publicly delivers an address about the Athenians and their religious beliefs and practices. And among his responses, he has these words to say. The God who made the world and everything in it does not live in shrines. For example, in this picture of the Parthenon, the shrine for the goddess Athena. The God who made everything, the God who actually exists, does not live in these kinds of shrines. And Athens had plenty of shrines, plenty of religious people, plenty of philosophers as well. And so Paul engages the philosophers, he engages the religious personalities, and wants to articulate for them a different view of who God is and what it means to live in relationship and life with that God. So you're starting to get the message. You're starting to get this sense that there is this caution, there is this critique about other religious practices coming from early Christian missionaries. There is a little bit more to be said about this relationship, however. When Paul writes the book of Romans, which is a letter to Christians in Rome, he has this to say in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. He says, when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. That is, even though Paul was a Jew and he grew up with God's law, and even though he believed that God's law was a special gift from God to shape God's special people, the people of Israel, that people within Israel did not always keep the law, and that there were those outside of Israel, the Gentiles, who lived the kind of life that the law was trying to get Israel to live. So Paul sees this very complex landscape where it's not just God gives law to one set of people and they keep it, and then everybody else God ignores and they don't have anything to go on. It's much more dynamic than that to Paul. Paul looks and he says, all right, look, the people who are given God's law don't always keep it and they don't live up to God's will. And then you have people who haven't even heard of the laws that have been given to the people of Israel, and they actually live out what God's trying to achieve. So to explain the pictures here that I've got before you to illustrate this, the picture on your left is a picture of the Ten Commandments and a heart, a human heart behind it. Just this notion that God's commandments are written on people's hearts. The picture on the right is a dove that's typically meant to depict, in Christian thinking, the Holy Spirit, the presence of God with someone or in a particular event. And in the center here, where the focus really needs to be, is an artistic depiction of the Good Samaritan story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 10. What's interesting about the Good Samaritan story is that the hero of the story, the one person who actually stops to help the guy who's been beat up and left for dead, is a Samaritan who has different religious beliefs and practices than the Jewish man he's helping. And the Jewish man who's been injured has been passed over by two very devout, allegedly, religious Jews, and a priest and a Levite. They pass over, they don't help. And you wonder, what good is their religion if they don't help? But here you have a guy who differs from the Jewish leaders who just passed over and the Jewish man who's been beat up, and he actually stops to help. He's the hero of the story. Even though his beliefs, convictions, and practices don't line up exactly with the Jewish people who were regarded as the survivors and the successors of the nation of Israel. So this illustrates one example of someone who is beyond the bounds of typical Israel, who had God's law, doing what the law requires. There's more that would need to be said there about the Samaritans and their possession of God's law, because there's a complexity to that history. But you get the idea. This is a great visualization of what it means for someone to have God's law in his heart and to act on it, while others who have been given God's law simply ignore it. So the policy, if we might call it this, is that early Christians peaceably, and I emphasize that word, rejected and spoke against other religions, but also recognized the ability of people to possess God's law in their hearts. Let's think about rationale. We can pick up from the text that at least one of the rationales for this posture, this policy, is that these different religions, religious beliefs and practices could be misleading to their adherents, and it could be counterproductive to God's mission in the world. What you believe about God or the gods matters, because it takes concrete shape in the life you live. And if God is interested in the life that people live, then God is going to be interested in the beliefs that people take of God and the kind of life choices they choose to make in relation to that. What you're going to do now is engage in a discussion on interreligious relationships with one another, where you're going to make a post, you're going to read all the posts of your group mates, and then you're going to give 2 replies. Your important anchoring question is going to be, if many different modern religions benefit the health of their practitioners, how should Christians think about this fact? And given the complexity and the delicateness of this kind of relationship, I just ask you to bear that in mind as you engage in conversation with your classmates. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this presentation was helpful for you.